In 1676, the Marquise de Brinvilliers stood trial in Paris for poisoning. It was a shocking revelation and result, and as it turns out, only the beginning of a much larger scandal known as the Affair of the Poisons. Learn about the scandal that rocked Paris next on this episode of Footnoting History. Hello, Footnoting History friends. It's Kristin here with one of the most delicious and scandalous and frankly bonkers episodes in history that I only recently learned about. And the more I read, the more I was like, no, come on, that can't be right. And also, this is insane. How have I not heard about this before? Chances are you maybe haven't either, but you really, really should. I've read the material on this a few times, and each time I both have a hard time digesting what went down and also figuring out just what went down. Remember that you can find a captioned version of this episode on our YouTube channel and the Footnoting History website. There will be some French words in this episode, and while your host is very good at reading French silently to herself, she's not always so good at the pronunciation, though she really does try. You can also read more about the Affair of the Poisons, and oh my history loves, you will want to. You will find a good start in the further reading section for this episode. Today, we're talking poison and murder and sorcery during the reign of Louis XIV, the old Sun King, who would not want to be remembered for this particular fiasco, or the state of his teeth later on in his life. Check out Kristin's episode from 2015 about that, and you're welcome for the dental nightmares. The incident known as the Affair of the Poisons was an extensive fiasco that was both somehow sensational and all anyone could talk about, and also a secret kept at the highest levels of the state. Everyone was talking about it. Very few people knew what the heck was happening. There were public executions and confessions, but the trials were secret and the confessions were not always voluntary. There are tons of sources for this. The medievalist in me is just struck with awe at how much was written and the variety, but every source needs a disclaimer. Hearsay, gossip, filtered court records, sealed court records, records that were destroyed because they were deemed to be too sensitive, confessions obtained under torture or fear. Take your pick. Actually, pick all of them because there's something for every one of these sources. What historians call the Affair of the Poisons technically began in 1678 when the first lieutenant general of the Paris police, a man named Nicolas de la Reynie, discovered that there was a plot afoot to poison the king. Scores of arrests were made, there were trials and executions, and it did not officially end until 1682 when the special court Louis ordered to deal with all of this was officially dissolved. However, there were things that happened earlier that were the opening salvo of the story that you really cannot bypass, and trust me, you don't want to. They're really good. And also, people continued doing and believing things for years after that got a lot of individuals in trouble during the heat of the scandal. Not to mention that some people caught up in these events were never formally tried because it would have been too outrageous, and so they were just imprisoned in terrible conditions, some in solitude for the rest of their lives, which horrifically, in my opinion, lasted for years. First, let me situate you in France in the 1670s. Louis XIV had been king of France for a long dang time by this point. He officially became king in 1643 when he was the ripe old age of 4, but there was a regency era where his mother and Cardinal Mazarin were really running the show. This lasted until Louis was 13 years old in 1651, but, he was 13, so he still needed help until 1661 when he assumed personal rule. Mazarin tends to get a lot of credit with teaching Louis the statecraft ropes, but he also trained Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the finance minister of France and did a lot of governmental stuff. And he died in 1683, so Colbert was around for the Affair of the Poisons, and he did have some involvement in how things played out. During the Affair of the Poisons, the French had been at war with the Dutch for a while. This is the Franco-Dutch War that lasted from 1672 to 1678, and France technically won, but they didn't achieve their ultimate goal, which was to destroy the Dutch Republic. And it was very costly for both sides, but in the moment, Louis was displaying a lot of strength. And at the end of the conflict, he was 40 years old and at the height of his power, and his reputational aura was probably about as good as it was going to get. 1678 was also the year that the Palace of Versailles was undergoing some massive renovations, when the Versailles you know and love was taking shape. Louis did not officially move the court there until 1682, which was the tail end of the Affair of the Poisons, but Louis had made up his mind in 1678 that Versailles was going to be the permanent seat of the court, and the French aristocracy revolved around the court, so people pretty much saw the writing on the wall. Within Louis's lifetime, they'd essentially all be there, jockeying for the king's favor and thus some power or financial benefit at that beautiful, expansive palace that also kind of was and smelled like one big urinal because the sanitation was rather limited. Men felt a-okay peeing anywhere, and it was never unoccupied long enough to really clean it. So, pluses and minuses. There also wasn't a whole lot of actual power to be had by the aristocracy in Louis's court, except by his discretion, and those little slivers of power sometimes sound silly to modern audiences. People really did want to do things like watch the king get dressed, or holding a candle for him, or being allowed to sit in the royal presence, because it meant you were on the in and you had a high social status, and you probably also got some kind of financial benefit from it. You might get land and thus money, and land could come with a better title. And if you were one of the people who really had Louis's affections or trust, other people wanted to be on your good side because you might influence him in their favor. People could get a little desperate in their attempt to gain these favors and the king's attention. One of the people who had the king's ear in a way no one else did, of course, was the king's mistress. In the 1670s, Louis had a few mistresses, but one had some longevity as the official mistress, the maîtresse en titre. And yeah, it was a formal position that was recognized publicly. She was officially presented and given her own apartments, and people had to defer to her. In 1674, that was the Marquise de Brinvilliers, often called Athénée. She was a lady-in-waiting to the queen who caught Louis's eye in the 1660s, and she would go on to become the official mistress and have 7 children with Louis, who he did formally recognize. 3 died young, and 4 would live to adulthood. 1 was a duke, 1 was a count who became the Grand Admiral of France, and 2 married dukes. During her reign as official mistress, Madame de Montespan had a lot of influence over the court, and she became very wealthy and enjoyed a lot of prestige, but she also had to deal with Louis having affairs with other women. And eventually she got phased out when Louis grew tired of her and turned his affections toward Mademoiselle de Fontag in 1678, a blonde aristocratic teenager from the Auvergne who the Abbé Choisy described as, quote, beautiful as an angel, stupid as a mule. I've also read her described as, quote, boring as a basket. But she was young and pretty and new, and Louis liked her, and that made Madame de Montespan uneasy. Tragically, Mademoiselle de Fontag grew ill and eventually died. I promise you, this is all relevant to our story, but we actually have to go back a few years to see how it all unfolded. There are some high stakes and some notable figures involved. The first really is that Marquise de Brinvilliers I mentioned at the top of the episode. Madame de Brinvilliers was born Marie-Madeleine d'Aubray in 1630. Her father was a big deal in Parisian government, and she married a marquis in 1651. She grew dissatisfied with her marriage, her financial situation, and soon members of her immediate family. Madame de Brinvilliers took a lover, a military man named Sainte-Croix, who was, I guess, very charismatic, and ultimately he allegedly became learned in the art of poisoning while he was spending some time in the Bastille, courtesy of her father, who had a lot of connections and did not like the affair. When he got out, Sainte-Croix rented a spot in Paris and set up a laboratory, and Madame de Brinvilliers got in on things. Poisoning was kind of in vogue at this time. It was considered a good way to get rid of people in your life you didn't want around with little notice. If, say, your husband was squandering all your wealth, or your father was meddling in your love affair, or you thought you might inherit money intended for your siblings if they died, poison might be your game. Many illnesses at the time were mysterious to people. People got sick and wasted away all the time, and it wasn't necessarily thought to be suspicious. Autopsies were sometimes conducted, but that did not mean that physicians knew what they were seeing when they opened up a body. Many deaths that were ruled to be of natural causes were looked at in hindsight as poisonings, as other evidence became available. But the post-mortem evidence was always difficult to read with precision. It also was not that unusual that someone might set up his own laboratory to futz around, because this was a time when the study of chemistry was developing and was fashionable, and this study sometimes overlapped with what we call alchemy. People were forever trying to refine certain metals and physical materials into gold and find or create that philosopher's stone, and also they were sometimes making poisons. Madame de Brinvilliers and her lover went around for years poisoning their little hearts out. They got the father, the siblings, probably some other people, sometimes directly, sometimes in cahoots with planted servants. Things unraveled in 1672. Saint-Croix died. Incriminating things were found in his laboratory. There were confessions, and Madame was on the run for many years until the law caught up with her, and she was eventually taken back to Paris, where she was convicted, tortured, and executed in July 1676. And it was wild. People were obsessed with this case, and none other than Louis himself was following it very closely. It was utterly shocking that a high-born woman would do such things. People thought the aristocracy were just literally better people, and the whole situation was, as I said, just nuts. And, as it turned out, that was only the tip of the iceberg. Nicolas de Lorigny, the chief of the Paris police, was a man on a mission in Paris in the later 17th century. To be fair, he had a lot of missions, and his work was cut out for him. He was sort of like a mayor-police chief combo. He was in charge of law enforcement, but also he had to deal with things like fires and floods and city hygiene. And historians tend to give him a lot of credit with making a lot of headway towards urban safety, as did Louis, who gave Lorigny a lot of authority, and he really seemed to respect the guy. As part of his mission, Lorigny arrested a woman named Magdalene de Lagrange in February of 1677. She was a somewhat successful fortune teller who also happened to dabble in other things, like forgery and poison. Those were the things that got her into trouble, though sorcery and witchcraft were still technically crimes in France at the beginning of the Affair of the Poisons. The French didn't really formally prosecute those things much by the 1670s. They also really didn't care about the fortune-telling and the astrology reading. What they did care about were things that they considered caused real harm to people, that you could prove in court, like, murder. While in prison, Lagrange said she knew other stuff about other people the authorities might be interested, like that there was a whole ring of poisoners out there, and they were after the king and the Dauphin, and Louis heard, and Louis was worried. But Lagrange didn't really give any real evidence about plots against the king that the police could use, and maybe she was just stalling for time. But then, in October, an anonymous letter was found in a Parisian church. It was from a widow to an admirer, Anne Somerset calls him. This admirer told the widow that he was going to put a, quote, white powder on the napkin of an important person. And the widow was upset about this. It was going to get them in trouble. This person was so important. There was no way people wouldn't look into it. And the widow was worried that she was doomed because she knew about it and didn't do anything. And this was a hard hint that the important person was the king, because it was punishable by death to not say anything about an impending crime against his majesty. This was treason for them both. No one knows who wrote this letter or who these two people were. And there is some suspicion that it was planted by a friend of Lagrange to help her out. If it were, it did not help her, and she was convicted, tortured, and executed. You might note the order of what I just said there. In France, at this time, torture was generally reserved for after a conviction to get all the remaining information out before the execution. In December of 1678, a lawyer named Perrin attended a very disturbing dinner party given by one Marie Vigoureux, another very successful Parisian fortune teller. It's not clear how this guy ended up at this dinner party, but there was also another fortune teller present, a woman named Marie Bosse, who got drunk and said that she was doing so great. She only had to poison 3 more people and she could retire. Perrin was so freaked out that he reported the whole thing to the Parisian police, and both Vigoureux and Bosse were arrested in January 1679, and so the dominoes continued to fall. La Bosse knew and worked with Lagrange, just reinforcing to La Reynie, the police chief, that there was a giant web of poisoners lurking in Paris, and there was a danger to the king. Lagrange was executed in February of 1679. La Vigoureux confessed that both she and La Bosse had a very important client, one Madame de Pouillon, who was put into a convent by her husband because he was convinced she was trying to kill him via poisons given to her from La Bosse. There were allegations that a member of the Royal Guard, a man named Francois Belot, was in on this whole mess. Things were getting crazy, and it was clear they were going to get even crazier. And Louis decided the way to deal with it all was by setting up a special court. He chose 14 judges who would be on a special tribunal. La Reynie was one of them. He was also still the lead investigator and served the role of rapporteur, which meant that he would gather all the evidence against someone and then give the other judges a summary of it. And then he'd be one of the people weighing in on a conviction and sentence. I tell you, this guy could just do it all, couldn't he? The idea behind the special court was that Louis did not want the regular courts to get bogged down with what was looking like it was going to be a ton of poisoning cases. And it was also kind of looking like a lot of high up individuals were going to be snared in this net. And Louis didn't want the bad press. If things came out in these trials that were embarrassing, he was hoping he could keep it all hush-hush. This special court sat at the Arsenal, which was a large military complex near the Bastille. The court was known as, quote, the burning chamber, because its goings-on were secret, or they were supposed to be, and the room was lit by torches. It was also because there had been a similar court in the 1500s that dealt with heresy, and heretics were burned. Many people who found themselves before this special court were burned as well. Both La Bosse and Vigoureux were convicted and tortured. La Vigoureux actually died during torture. On May 10th, La Bosse was burned alive at the stake, and they made her 14-year-old daughter go and watch so that she might learn a lesson. I bet she did. In the course of their confessions prior to their deaths, another incredibly famous fortune teller, a woman named Catherine Montvoisin, known as La Voisin, was also arrested. She was a big deal. Madame Voisin was a 42-year-old woman whose husband was also kind of a deadbeat, and she was supporting them and their 3 children through fortune-telling and selling various potions and charms. And she was raking it in and had a nice house with a walled garden. La Bosse said there was a, quote, lady of rank who wanted La Voisin to help her poison her husband. And this anonymous woman was not alone, and it seemed everyone was lining up to have La Voisin help them poison their enemies or have people fall in love with them, and sometimes also disposing of their aborted fetuses, some of which she allegedly buried in her garden. La Voisin was arrested as she was leaving church on 12th of March, 1679. She was imprisoned in the castle fortress of Vincennes. Today, as then, Vincennes is in a suburb of Paris, but it's very easy to get to from Paris and highly worth a visit if you're in the area. She was there for almost a year, and her imprisonment was not easy. La Voisin had a reputation for drinking, and her jailers kept her drunk a lot, hoping she'd spill some good stuff, and she kind of did. She named many well-born, respectable people, members of the court and the bourgeoisie. It was rumored that Madame de Montespan was one of her clients, and that she had sought the help of La Voisin for years for love magic before becoming the king's official mistress, and after she did, keeping him interested and attacking her rivals. That boring as a basket young woman who died suddenly and mysteriously, that was rumored to be poison obtained from La Voisin. However, La Voisin never actually named Madame de Montespan, even under intense questioning, imprisonment, and ultimately torture. On February 22nd, 1680, La Voisin was burned at the stake, and though she never named Montespan, other people who were closely connected with La Voisin named her as a client. And I'm just giving you the major highlights here. There were a lot of other people talking and dots being connected. La Voisin had a daughter named Marguerite who saw everything that went on and who sometimes helped because she said she was so terrified of her mother. She claimed that de Montespan's maid was often a go-between for potions, but also that Madame de Montespan visited their house when she was trying to supplant the king's then mistress. La Voisin also had a sort of in-house priest she worked with, a man named Etienne Guibourg. You needed a guy like that to help with your dark rituals, someone to consecrate a host and perform your black masses and stuff. And he corroborated the daughter's story and gave a lot of very chilling details about the rituals that de Montespan was said to have participated in. She allegedly laid on an altar and had love spells performed over her naked body, and sometimes those spells required the blood of a newborn infant. The potions the maid took back to court for de Montespan to use on Louis had bat's blood and ground up baby bones. Stuff that if you were to put it in a horror movie today, hopefully someone would tell you, whoa, back up. No one's that witchy. But anyway. These two were backed up by La Voisin's lover, Adam Lesage, who was also a magician/alchemist because wasn't everyone in Paris in the 1670s and 80s. There was also another sorceress named Françoise Philastre, who was arrested and claimed that she worked for Madame de Montespan and gave some pretty damning testimony that she eventually retracted after she was convicted and tortured, but the cat was already out of the bag. Louis did not take this super well, and there also wasn't a whole lot he could do about de Montespan. She had borne him several children who he had recognized as his own, and so to allow de Montespan to go down like that would have been way too embarrassing for Louis. So, essentially his reaction was to shut it down. The court was soon dissolved. Nothing really happened to de Montespan. She was phased out as the king's official mistress, but continued to live at court and had the occasional friendly visit from Louis, who wanted to keep up appearances. Marguerite Montvoisin, Etienne Guibourg, and Adam Lesage were all sentenced to life imprisonment. They never made it to trial because Louis did not want anyone to hear what they had to say. I mean, that's a pretty dismal sentence, and they were there for years. Marguerite may have been there for decades. So, I don't know about you, but I got a lot of questions. And the main one, at least for me, is like, were people really doing the things they were accused of? Like, couldn't people have just looked in La Voisin's garden if there were a bunch of fetuses buried there? Wouldn't they have found one or two if they dug it up? Yeah, they sure could have looked. It doesn't seem like they did, though. There is some disagreement about whether or not the garden was excavated, but many historians don't find the evidence for a search. It doesn't appear in the sources, and Louis himself ordered that they stop looking into the abortion stuff, and that's probably because it looked like his mistress was involved with La Voisin. So he did not want to know the answer to that question. There certainly was a market for what Parisians were calling, quote, inheritance powders. Gotta love the French and their dry sass. But also I wonder if the poisons worked. There is a lot of mention of arsenic in these accusations, and you bet that can be deadly, but it's also not clear that what was being peddled or found in searches actually was arsenic. Sainte-Croix was trying to come up with something new in his laboratory that couldn't be traced at all, and who knows what that guy was making. Dude may have ended up killing himself when his protective mask broke during one of these experiments, but that's another story for another time. During all these investigations, authorities discovered a lot of other suspicious but unidentified things that they did sometimes test out on animals. But that doesn't mean that those things would have had the same effect on humans. There was a rumor that surfaced after the Marquise de Brinvilliers' execution that she went to a hospital for the poor and tested out her poisons on them before slipping them to dear old Papa. That story is likely apocryphal. Some historians give it more credence than others, but the judges weren't doing stuff like that at these trials. The court was reluctant to convict purely based on post-mortem evidence because it could be interpreted different ways, and they relied more on confessions, which we know are problematic because of how they were often obtained. So just because someone was accused of a crime or even confessed to a crime, that didn't mean they had actually committed that crime. The most you can say is that certainly people thought these crimes were being committed and that maybe some people were guilty of some of the things they were accused of. And the king definitely didn't want the full story to get out. There is quite the slow burn, so to speak, in a changing mentality around magic and its practitioners that precedes and postdates the affair of the poisons. The affair really does showcase a lot of changing ideas about the supernatural, the natural world, and the law, even if Louis never wanted you to hear about it. This has been Footnoting History. Thank you for spending this time with us and learning a bit about this absolutely wild story. And remember that if you'd like to keep Footnoting History open access and help us bring you more interesting tales from the past, you can donate via our Ko-Fi or Patreon links, or by purchasing some merch, or by leaving us a good review. Thank you so much for everyone who supports us. And remember, the best stories are in the footnotes.